Alright, real talk. WoW is an utter nightmare. MMOs in general kind of are. World of Warcraft's combat UX, that is, user experience, it needs an overhaul because it is an inconsistent nightmare. It works for us who are used to it. Believe me, it could be so much better. And if you have ever wondered why custom weak aura setups and meticulously crafted plater setups are basically considered mandatory by so many, then I am about to tell you why. And to cut a long-ass story short, basically, UX is everything around how a player, that means you, engages with a game. The sights, the sounds, the button presses, the feelings. UI is almost a subcategory of that, dealing with how you interface with the game overall. Both of these, in WoW's gameplay, are honestly, compared to a lot of the industry, kind of abysmal. They show its age, and the best way to explain is to run through examples. For argument's sake, I will use the modern Dragonflight UI in this video, and later explain how a good add-on setup attempts to fix this. And if you want fixed, today's sponsor. Our patrons, who this month are getting the Warlock loot because it's Warlock month, which means that it's metal as fuck. The class art is just awesome. Here's the art, which is still work in progress, and our latest beast pin in this year's collection. Patrons get their name in the credits, early access to upcoming videos, such as our brand new lore series, and hours of podcast content that, right now, is diving deep into Warcraft's lore. We're going hard here, more and more so as time goes on, so if you'd like to join up, you can hit the link down below. Thank you for your support. Let's get to it. How do you know when you can use an ability? One of two options, when it comes off cooldown or when you have enough resources. Now where do you see that? For cooldown, down here. For resources, also down here. Or over here, assuming you actually know the cost. That works for combo points and holy power, but less so for bar-based resources like mana or fury. That's easy and not too bad. Except you're spending a bunch of time looking down here. Now, let's add some more gameplay. Let's take a look at Frostmage and Dragonflight as our example. Your primary goal is to launch Flurry and then follow it up with 2 Ice Lances. Fill with Frostbolt and use your other cooldowns and abilities as much as possible. Frozen Orb, Baseline, then the likes of Ice Nova, Ray of Frost, or Glacial Spike, maybe, when available. Same for Icy Veins and Rune of Power. Now, how do you know when Flurry is up? Down here. You just know when you've pressed Ice Lance twice because you're the one doing it, funny enough, so the debuff that it applies doesn't matter. Sweet. But wait, there's a Brain Freeze, which is a proc that resets Flurry's cooldown and buffs its damage. How do you know that happened? Well, introducing to you spell alerts. These overlaid textures on the screen that mostly tell you when you have a buff. Now, I'll cut them a break because this used to be necessary for Brain Freeze since it turned Flurry into an instant cast, but now it's unnecessary. At the same time, the button glows and you have a visible buff, so the spell alert is now unnecessary. Where it's still needed is for Fingers of Frost, the other Frostmage proc. When you get a free Shattered Ice Lance, you know because of these spell alerts and these buffs. But the button doesn't glow, which means if you're looking down here, you won't even see that. Then there's their Mastery Icicles. Despite being a class mechanic, they're not represented on their UI. They actually appear as buffs, but also in the world floating above your character's head. Now, this is fair since you don't actually need to know about these. Of course, unless you've got Glacial Spike talented. In this case, Glacial Spike glows when you've got 5 icicles lined up, in the same way that Rampage does for Fury Warriors, but other resource-intensive buttons don't. So that's more inconsistencies. Basically, individual logic is sound, but overall it ends up being a mess. Let's look at a few more talents. So, Freezing Rain buffs Blizzard during Frozen Orb. The only change that you get is that Blizzard glows. A Chain Reaction, a stacking Ice Lance buff, is only visible as a buff up here. Cold Front, which drops a frozen orb every 30 frost bolts or flurries, is tracked up here as a buff. So if you are looking for flurries cooldown, you also have to look away to see this. A Snowstorm, a talent that stacks up Cone of Cold damage during Blizzard, has Cone of Cold glow when ready. Now, if you've been following along, you'll notice that there seems to be different rules for everything. It's not consistent at all. The same goes for a huge number of specs in the game. Buffs, action bars, spell alerts, all three in vastly different parts of the screen by default. You're just looking everywhere. Here's a quick rundown of a list that we've compiled. Just look at the state of this. The inconsistency across class and spec of what ability is tracked in these different systems is crazy. It's so inconsistent. Basically, the whole game is a Frankenstein's monster of expansions and different philosophies thrown together into combat. It's a big old mess. Now, it does work for us because we're used to it, but by default, you have no idea where to look. And we have not even talked about enemies yet. And bear in mind, you're watching this as an experienced World of Warcraft player, not a newbie who's going to be very confused. But wait, you can sort of remedy this in Dragonflight. You can move action bars and buffs around, sure, but as we've covered recently, with the number of cooldowns that you have to track, this does get unwieldy unless you create an amazing custom setup. And having to do that completely goes against having good UX, because it is not good design to present players with a problem that they can fix themselves. At the same time, MMORPGs are a notoriously information-rich experience in combat, and the last thing that we would want is for the game to be made too simple just to make life easier. So, what the hell do we do? Oh, weak auras. It's obviously the pragmatic answer. Again, it is not good UX design to have a player solve their own problems, but when the community is solving a problem the same way that they do with articles that are explaining shit that the game doesn't, because Wowhead basically does most of Blizzard's job, then hey, job's mostly done. You'll notice spec weak auras packs, right? Like by Luxthros and Athanar. These are naturally simple, they're very informationally dense, but when you get used to them, they're quite readable and at least they're consistent. Now, those two lads, of course, are the most notable here, and they've ended up with the same rough philosophy, which is centered, grouped, fixed icon locations, different effects for an ability on cooldown, one coming up soon, and actually active. Abilities that are utility are often a bit smaller or hidden until they are active or on cooldown, so if you don't see, say, a Barkskin icon, then you know you're good to use Barkskin. Now, that does kind of get rid of needing 30 plus icons on your screen when really all you need is the core combat icons. They also include all your resources in the same place instead of, off by your player frame. So in other words, a good player UI that shows you what you need to see and doesn't show you what you do not need to see. But it's also highly custom, and it's not something Blizzard would really be able to implement or spend their energy on to upkeep, especially when you remember that people play World of Warcraft on thousands of different devices and displays across now 38 whole specs. So what the hell's our point with this video? It is, in 11.0 and beyond, we think Blizzard needs an initiative internally to solve the combat UX problem. They need a way for players to know everything that is relevant to their gameplay at a glance. Some of that maybe will come in the form of reducing the amount of procs that crowd your buff bar so that only the core ones show. Or what if it ends up being them redesigning the personal resource display? Because the hilarious thing is, the personal resource display was almost Blizzard taking like the first step to a fantastic unified solution. And then they just stopped. So maybe they want to pick that up. But essentially we think the Blizzard needs to sit down, work this stuff out, add some more action bar options, and ideally ship with a preset that actually gives you the information that you need in a reasonable place so that you log in and you feel like the game's UI is enhancing your gameplay and supporting you. That would require them sitting down and thinking about how they want to display information in World of Warcraft, because as a team, it really does not feel like that has been done in a very long time. Spell alerts are nice, but making them for every buff would be insane. Your screen would just be flashing in madness. Instead, perhaps, they could take inspiration from some other video games. One of them could be Final Fantasy XIV. It has these job gauges. Some people really like them, some people think they're a bit gaudy, and that's why there's actually a simple mode version. These are pretty damn effective. I think they look great. There's a timer for key buffs and, any resources in a tiny but clean form. Imagine the same for combo points, energy, and slice and dice, or soul shards and dot durations. Looking at modern AAA UI design would help too. The likes of God of War and Doom Eternal are obviously simpler action games, but they are so good at using little dots, flashes, and sound effects to communicate things in the heat of battle that you almost never need to take your eyes off the insane, frenetic action. There's a second issue, but it shouldn't take quite as long for us to go through, though. Have you ever tried to see what's going on in a dungeon? This shit's insane! They've played us for absolute fools, as if trying to see your own combat wasn't hard enough. Now you have to pick out a cast or a buff and read it amongst a veritable sea of nameplates that are, to make it even worse, transparent. At least they've recently gotten more consistent with having text callouts for spells to pay attention to and spell target effects that are consistent. And the real truth is, if you actually learn what to look for, it's kind of not that hard. But all the same, these problems all blend together. If you've ever used a good custom plater profile, it's insane. You see crazy amounts of stuff that is presented super clearly. You're like a god of info. Massive flashing cast bars for dangerous shit, specific marks and nameplates for enemies to focus or lock down, buffs and debuffs you just can't miss. It is bloody bonkers. Even things like knowing the target of a spell can be important at times, but the game doesn't communicate that to you without actually targeting the enemy who's doing the casting, meaning unless you know to look for it, you'll never find it. All of that is to say, nameplates need an overhaul, Blizz. It would even be ideal if they continued to make enemies more obviously do something dangerous with spell effects, because a lot of the fun from a game is actually from executing shit that you want to do or need to do, and the opposite of that, not having information, is utterly miserable. Healers giving off some obvious light or healing effects during a cast, enemies glowing bright red during enrages, even raid mechanics taking inspiration from FF14's use of symbols and colors to make it easier for people to communicate. There is so much that can be done here, but disclaimer, there is a line, because playing with weak ores that include a sound pack with callouts, that ends up being a step too far. That just makes it into fantasy MMO Simon Says. But I guess without the fake outs. Generally, for Dragonflight patches or in the next expansion, we think they need to continually improve on the signal to noise ratio in raids and in dungeons, and really, really, really rethink their combat UX from the ground up. Because, man, all the praise people have had for how responsive and fluid WoW combat, is, that holds up today. No one does hotkeys feeling good and responsive like Blizz do with WoW. I really do believe that, even though I love many other MMOs. But there's other parts of the combat experience that need a new lease of life. Everything here has been built off a 2004 base, but much like how World of Warcraft's recent UI overhaul has decided, hang on a second, we need to rebuild the foundations. I truly believe the Blizzard needs to do similar here with overall UX. It is so important for players, but it's the sort of thing that as a player, you rarely really notice, right? It's just one of those behind the scenes design things. So hopefully this is on their radar, because honestly, Dragonflight feels feels strange. Maybe we'll cover this in a video soon, but Dragonflight feels a lot like it could be a precursor to something very different. And actually, I think I mean that in a good way. So there you go. World of Warcraft has a UX problem. Spooky. But I hope that today we were able to call to light a few interesting little problems that are just a result of an MMO being iteratively built upon the base that the previous patch or expansion left. And that just means that sometimes, you kind of go off in your own direction, and maybe we need to think about the foundation again. And if there's a theme for anything in Dragonflight, it's that. Let me know what you think anyway. And are there games where you really have felt like the UX has just been a cut above the rest? Because man, when that happens, it just feels so good and so slick. I mean, I could give one example. The ping system in Apex Legends. Truly next level usability. All right, have a good day. See you next time.